Hey everybody! Welcome to CAF Warbird Tube, the show where we talk about World War II, aviation, history, and so much more. Warbird Tube is produced by the Commemorative Air Force, the world's largest flying museum. Our mission is to educate, inspire, and honor through flight and living history experiences. The CAF began the Warbird movement more than 65 years ago, and thanks to the support of individuals like you, we continue to grow strong. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and now our host, Steve Buss. Thanks for watching and keep 'em flying.
Good evening and welcome to CAF Warbird Tube. Tonight on episode number 177, we take a look at a pivotal period in October 1943, known now as Black Week. Now, whether you're joining us for the very first time or you're a regular with Warbird Tube, we're thrilled to have you with us tonight. If you enjoy our content, please don't forget to spread the word on your favorite social media platform. And if you are a subscriber on YouTube, click the bell icon and you'll get notifications when our new episodes are posted. Warbird Tube is made possible by the Commemorative Air Force. To find out more about the CAF, our events, aircraft, local units, or how you can join the fun, visit our website at commemorativeairforce.org. Joining us now from CAF's National Aviation Education Center is the Vice President of Education, Nathan Huegen. Nathan, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Steve. Great to be here.
Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you became the Vice President of Education with CAF.
So I've had a very interesting career. It's one that I call a series of happy accidents. I was a public school teacher in New Orleans in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. I taught high school for what was then the state-run Recovery School District. I did that from 2007 until 2010. And I kind of lucked into a job with the National World War II Museum in the education department, which later turned into a job directing all of the educational travel programs, which included leading tours to, I think 20 plus different countries, Europe, Asia, South Pacific, kind of all of the above. And one that I really enjoyed was an 8th Air Force tour that I got to do with Donald Miller in East Anglia, England, going to some of the old bomber bases, specifically the 13th Wing with the 100th, the 95th, and the 390th Bomb Group. And I really got to know the locals out there. And when Commemorative Air Force had this opening, it just seemed like a natural fit.
Well, very good. Well, tonight we're going to take a look back at a very pivotal time in history in 1944, and about this time in 1943. And it's something that's become known as Black Week. And for those not familiar with us, give us a little background, and then let's dive into the details.
Yeah, so Black Week, 1943, and there's always a lot of questions. Why would they plan to have so many missions stacked one on top of the other? And where I mentioned my career is a series of happy accidents, scheduling aerial bombardment is a major puzzle piece in which nature and weather get to dictate when and what you're going to do. And so it wasn't, sitting in a room in January 1943 and somebody says, we're going to send these groups on 4 hellacious missions almost back to back. We're going to do 3 consecutive days. It's, oh my gosh, it's October, the days are getting shorter, and weather looks good. Let's get these out there. Let's prove our concept. And that's how we end up in this 1943 situation that really is going to test what people knew or thought that bombers were going to be able to achieve. And it's going to stress the men who are involved to really no end. So what I'm going to do is kind of take people through the organization and background of the 8th Air Force prior to Black Week, the circumstances leading up to Black Week, and then we'll go through 3 of the individual missions. And there'll be a few omissions here and there. There's going to be diversionary targets. Sometimes they go out with 3 cities, but we're going to focus just on one for the purposes of this talk, just to streamline things a little bit. But when I give the total numbers at the end of losses, I'll wrap everything up that'll include the diversionary, secondary, tertiary targets, things like that. And so what I'll do first, people have used this quote quite a bit. The bomber will always get through. And I want to put it into a little bit of context as to who said it and when. And so we're looking at Stanley Baldwin, British Prime Minister. And in 1932 is when he's saying this. He's noticing that the aerial bombardment, the bombers themselves, are becoming more and more effective, in fact, outpacing what fighters will be able to do in the air. And Stanley Baldwin is an advocate of disarmament. He believed that continuing to arm is going to inevitably lead to war. And almost switching on a dime, in 1932, he's advocating, this is where we're at. And a real perspective on this means we need to build more offense. And what the collateral damage, this is really looking forward into what's going to be happening in a dozen years. Looking forward, this is going to impact the lives of civilians in a major way. And this gets into what becomes known in a shorthand as bomber doctrine, or ideas espoused by the so-called bomber mafia of aerial bombardment can do several things to bring about a surrender without as many boots on the ground, that you can break the enemy's capacity to produce and break their will to continue the war. And that's what we're looking at in the 1930s. That's what the early proponents of bomber doctrine really believe, that these bombers can win a war almost by themselves. Infantry, sea power, almost secondary to what air power will be able to do. And when I go through this, I want to bring in kind of a few characters as I tell this story. And one of my characters will be the rugged B-17 Flying Fortress. Flying Fortress given a name by a Seattle news reporter who was just impressed by all the guns and armament that he saw on it. So one character, our B-17 Flying Fortress. Another character that really is going to play a role in how Black Week happens will be Ira Eaker. And that third character, kind of as a collective whole, is the airmen and the crewmen. And if we look at our diagram here, and I'm borrowing this from Don Miller, this is a sort of staple of talks he used to give. When you look at where the individuals are in this plane, and if you've not had a chance to be inside a CAF B-17, a sentimental journey out doing tours as we speak, if you don't get her this year, you can get on her next year. Going inside that plane and seeing how claustrophobic things can be in there. And whenever a mission is ordered and those guys have to get in that plane and they come back from that mission, sometimes 100 holes, 800 holes, they're wounded in there, what convinces them to get back in this very small metal tube, where if you're going from nose to tail, you're walking over a roughly 10-inch wide ledge that goes over the bomb bay. And just for some images of where these guys are, we have our bombardier up here in the news, and these are of course all propaganda staged photos for the education of people back home, but they do really show where these guys are. Our ball turret gunner underneath with his feet up in these stirrups, roughly at shoulder height, so not a very comfortable position for this guy to be in for hours during a mission. One of the models, I believe it was the F model, actually had a evacuation tube or a urination tube, a relief tube that pointed at this ball turret, and if somebody used that tube, he would have to rotate the other way so that he didn't get kind of this yellow fog that would be on his visual screen in there. And then if we get inside the plane, you'll have jobs like your radio engineer or your navigator, a flight engineer, radio operator. They're going to be trying to work in this pressure environment, sometimes with oxygen masks on if they're at altitude, this rumbling, shaking that's going on with the 17, and plotting by hand. We have Aviation Education Center. We try to teach kids how to do these kind of plots and charts. So today they can just pull your phone out and it'll tell you, or if you're flying, just make sure you follow your pink line on your Garmin. But we do try to bring in some of these concepts that these guys had to learn in an often very rushed training. Of course, our gunners, you notice his heavy gloves and just the heavy jackets and uniforms that they have to wear. Sometimes maybe even that blue, what they call bunny suit, or the electrical heated suit that would be underneath all of this. So again, not a great experience, not a great place to be fighting this war in the air, something that had never been done before. And then our waist gunners in the back of the aircraft going right next to each other with this. And again, these gunners are going to have a range at which they're able to shoot. They're trying to not have the B-17s shooting at each other, so there's only a certain degree that they're instructed to turn these guns when they're in a formation and to keep their range of fire, protecting other aircraft, but not shooting at other aircraft in your typical formation. If you look underneath from your screen, the gun that's on the left, sort of pointing out to your left, you look underneath, that is a chemical toilet. We wrote an article recently on how airmen went to the bathroom in their planes if they had to go, and that was one that, this is a picture that I'm kind of repurposing from that article. Now, did the Germans understand this? Yes. And when I worked with Don Miller, he often called this portion of World War II the world's first and only bomber war. Not the only war bombers were used, not the only war with aerial bombardment, but the first and only bomber war, meaning that each side, and if you're talking about Japan or Germany versus the United States and its allies, each side is ramping up its capacity to both attack and defend from the air. And did the Germans understand how a B-17 worked? Yes, they did. They had instructors instructing the young pilots, the new pilots, on how to attack a B-17, a B-24, any of a Lancaster, any of the Allied bombers. And this, I love finding these models. These are in the German Federal Archives, these pictures. These models with wire that's showing where the fields of fire from the guns on a B-17 can reach. And through knowing those fields of fire, they can plot how their fighters are going to attack. And here you'll see those wires on a B-17 with a German plane, and this is just staged just for education purposes with the German plane coming in. Those pilots will be taught how to maneuver away from these American fields of fire. Here's a picture taken in Sicily in 1942 showing a B-24 with the instructor holding the plane. This is sort of like when we do fake wrench turning, though, for maintenance on our aircraft. He's just staging this for a photo for his press, but showing how to come in and avoid those fields of fire from our B-24 in this instance, and the other picture with the 17. And also in their training manuals, you would see images like this, that if you're approaching from any of these areas that are in these cones, you're going to be within this aircraft's field of fire. And so the German pilots are coming in with an awareness and a readiness to attack, especially individual aircraft, but they'll take this in and understand how to attack when bombers are in formation. And one example of a formation, this will be something that Curtis LeMay devises after an August raid in 1943 on Schweinfurt. He'll be devising, and they'll continue to manipulate these as needed, these very tight box formations that'll depend both on space from each other, lateral space, and altitude, so your vertical space, to maximize these fields of fire. And it's very similar to what you would see the Germans doing on the Atlantic Wall, that they're not building isolated gun positions that are just there to shoot forward. The idea is to create these fields of interlocking fire and a mutual support defensive system. And so in the air, you can take advantage both of that lateral and that vertical space to create this protection. What this means is that your bombers cannot deviate from their formations. When they're in formation, they stay in formation as long as they can. No evasive actions, because that opens up gaps. And then those Germans who have been trained on what a B-17 or a B-24's field of fire is, those Germans can maneuver in those spaces, take advantage of the gaps in the formation, and then they can start to pick off the weakest and most exposed bombers within their dogfights. Now to get to how does the 8th Air Force work? And this will apply both to any other Air Force from World War II that you're studying. Of course, these are all branches of the Army, so you're going to see a lot of Army structure and organization coming into this. So our 8th Air Force is an overall organization based in England. You'll have your bombers and your fighters are based in a region known as East Anglia. That's your Cambridge, Bury St. Edmunds, Norwich area, roughly an airfield every few miles in this countryside. Your overall 8th Air Force broken out into 4 sections, your air service, ground air support, fighter command, bomber command. Then your command broken down into your air divisions. Those divisions will then be broken down into wings. Those groups will then be broken down, those wings broken down into groups, and your groups broken out into squadrons. But what this means is that an individual pilot, so if I'm anybody listening as a grandfather, father, uncle who was in the 8th Air Force, was a crewman on a plane, how he gets his assignment is somebody in command tells that this division is going to be attacking this region of Germany or this city in Germany. Then those wings are going to be assigned, then the groups are going to be assigned, then the squadrons will be assigned into where they're going to form up, which all leads to your family member, your ancestor, sitting in a room, awaiting a briefing. A curtain falls on the screen, and it plots a course, and this is where he's going to go. And he's going to play that one plane role that goes from his element, his squadron, up to his group, up to his wing, up to his division. When you research some of these missions, some records will say this mission was simple, it was an easy one. And you can read from another crewman on the same mission, and it was hellacious. It was the worst thing they'd ever experienced because of when they're coming in, what it looked like from their point of view. And a caution we've always got when we interview veterans or when we read oral histories, a veteran in combat is going to know roughly what's 30 yards in front of him if it's on the ground. From the air, they're going to know what they can visually recognize, what they see, and then what they hear back at base. So if the raid is going to go on for several hours, the first planes over target might have a rough time, the later planes might not. And so that can cause a little bit of, I thought this was a terrible raid, but this group, this airman is saying that things went pretty swimmingly. So there's our organization. And then in this bigger picture is kind of a confusing one. But here's how this is all broken out into the 3 bombardment divisions that are in Bomber Command of the 8th Air Force. These will get added to, subtracted from, all those kind of things. One that I focused on a lot in my tours was the 13th Combat Bombardment Wing. Probably the one of the most interesting ones I've ever been able to visit the base for is over in the 1st Bombardment Division, that top one, the 482nd. That was a group known as the Carpetbaggers. They dropped the Jedburgh, the operatives, French-speaking operatives into France. They dropped supplies to resistance groups. They were not a traditional bombardment wing. Very rarely did they go out on a typical bombardment mission. But here's where all these bomb groups are located, and that's just for the organization. How do you construct a 500, 700, or 1,000 bomb raid? You assign it and you spread it out across all of these different groups. Where are these groups? I mentioned East Anglia, England. Cambridge, you see kind of toward the left, center left of the screen. Norwich off to the right. We've got some groups even to the west of the countryside around Cambridge. What these airmen got to experience in England was a type of war that mentally was very trying for them and had never really been attempted before. What these guys have is a rural pastoral countryside with very plain farmers. For the American airmen coming in with all of their supplies, these aircraft, they may as well have been from Mars. For the people who lived in this rural area between Cambridge and Norwich. And what the airmen get is they get this hospitality from these rural people, especially the kids. The kids love coming up to the planes. When we build an airfield, it's built on farmers' lands. The landowner makes a deal. The RAF and the U.S. Army construct an airfield. And if the farmers are still farming the land around it, they're actually able to get onto the base. And that's how you see these kids getting onto the base, hanging out with airmen, sitting in the planes, taking pictures, running errands for the airmen in town. They'll also be able to get coffee, hot meals, passes directly into town where they can just take a train to head into London. Then when they go on their missions, you're going to have most of the time a very boring time forming up. You're going to have most of the time a relatively easy flight over the English Channel. Then it's the flak. Then it's the fighters. Then you're over target. Then there's a flak again. Then there's the fighters. Then those coastal artillery again. So for several hours, these guys are being shot at. They're being chased. They're seeing their comrades go down in aircraft all around them. When they land, they go to their interrogation or their briefing on their base, and then they go and sleep in a bed. And then if they don't have a mission the next morning, they wake up and it's kind of a normal day in the East Anglia countryside. There might be a dance that night. But then when they get called for a mission again, they're going to go up and repeat it all again. So this really harsh dichotomy of intense combat, at which it's, for a lot of these guys, it's a numbers game. Skill can only get you so far in the air, to a very easy, peaceful life on the ground. And just for a close-up image of what we're looking at here, you can see where each individual group is. And you can even see how these bomb divisions were clustered, with the 1st Bomb Division toward the left. You have the 3rd Bomb Division sort of on the right and down, and the 2nd Bomb Division up toward the north. And then even north of this would be where the RAF bombers were located at their airfields. Where is East Anglia in England? I used to teach high school and college students. I can tell them that England was next to China, and they believe me. But where is East Anglia? It's this black dot to the northeast of London, giving them access very flat. It was great for constructing airfields. And you saw on that map, every 4 to 7 miles, you could have another airfield. Very flat, and gave access to hitting the center of Europe from there. Another question I used to get a lot is, what did it look like when they took, how long did it take to fly some of these missions? So if you trace there, you can see East Anglia, that hump coming off of Great Britain. And you can see, if you follow that directly to the east, you'll see Bremen. So what is it on the timing for the first mission of Black Week, October 8, 1943 with Bremen? These are the official records. This is logging the very first takeoff and the very first return landing. So this won't necessarily be an individual crewman's, airman's experience. So 11:43, first takeoff recorded for the Bremen mission. Of course, they've been in briefings for a long time before this, readying of the aircraft. So they've got hours before this, before they're even hitting the first takeoff. Then every 30 seconds at every individual airfield involved in this raid, another aircraft is going to take off. Then they're going to form up. And it's going to roughly be a little over 3 hours before the first planes are hitting the European coast. Then at 3:21 in the afternoon, first bombs released over target in Bremen. At roughly 4:30 in the afternoon, the first aircraft in this mission have departed the European coast. A little after 5, the first logged return landing takes place. Now, Harry Crosby, great book, On a Wing and a Prayer. You'd see him, he was a principal character in the recent Apple miniseries, Masters of the Air. His logging of the takeoff in the 100th bomb group, roughly 12 o'clock. In 18 minutes, his bomb group is in formation. 45 minutes after takeoff, they've joined up with 2 more air groups. 1:30, so an hour and a half after takeoff, their air divisions together. They're still over England. They've been circling, looking for other groups, gathering everything up. His bomb's away 3:25 in the afternoon, so he's a little away from the first aircraft. They take some damage, and he's going to make a rough emergency landing at an RAF airfield near to Norwich. He doesn't know the exact time, but he figures they spent 30 minutes on the ground waiting for the RAF personnel to come find them. Then he's got another roughly hour by truck before he gets back to his base in Thorpe Abbotts, England. So that's one specific mission for him. Another individual we have in the story from the American Air Power Heritage Museum Oral Histories in the National Aviation Education Center. So they're up in an archive in this building, just on our second story. Dean Todd, he remembers that they had to turn around, never got over the European coast, turned around due to mechanical failures in one of their engines. That still was 4.5 hours in the air. And that's for an aircraft that didn't even make it to the European coast, still 4.5 hours put on that airplane and on that crew. Now, back up a little bit. Milestones prior to October 1943, and you guys can see a lot of this, but this places this all into context. We have our Battle of Britain. That's our few, the Spitfires versus the 109s. That's all going to take place in 1940. So that's our fall of France, Germany's plans to knock England out of the war, maybe lead to a land invasion, which then starts the seeds of the bomber war. The British are going to strike first with a bombing over a city. They'll bomb Berlin on August 25th. That starts the Blitz. The Germans will retaliate by bombing English cities, leading to the devastating raid on Coventry in November of that year. The Americans will start to show up the next year, 4th of July, 1942, our first air operation, on borrowed aircraft, on sort of a medium aircraft, not the heavy bombers that we'll become famous for later. That will start with a bombing raid over Rouen, France, August 17, 1943. Then this is one that didn't get a lot of attention in light of Dresden. People always hear of Dresden in 1945 as being this devastating firestorm. Bomber Command and the 8th Air Force learned how to ignite firestorms in July 1943 in Hamburg. This was a week of pounding relentless missions using incendiaries, a lot of technology, such as window or chaff, those foil strips designed to confuse radar. That will be used for the first time on the Hamburg mission. Devastating firestorm at which the death toll is higher than what you'll see in Dresden just under 2 years later. And so that's going to put us on the eve of Black Week in 1943. And August, that mission in Schweinfurt, August 17, 1943, with 60 aircraft lost, that's going to be one that creates the impetus for the tight combat box formations that I showed earlier. So Black Week, the missions that I'll be looking at in just a little bit of detail start October 8th with Bremen. And that's what I just mentioned, Harry Crosby's raid, Dean Todd turning around. The timings on that. Marienburg, which if you're looking for it on a map, is now Malbork in Poland. This was an East Prussian city near to Danzig or modern-day Gdansk in Poland. So Marienburg is going to be a deep, deep raid over in modern-day Poland. Münster, and then another follow-up raid on Schweinfurt on October 14th. Another oral history from our collection. One of the first ones I read, very interesting individual, Donald Bertholf. He's from Harlingen, Texas originally. He's a navigator with the 100th Bomb Group. And he flew the first 3 of these missions of Black Week. In Bremen, his recollection was the flak was too great and the altitude was too high. They came into Bremen at 25,000 feet. That's where they dropped the bombs. And Marienburg, he remembers that they creamed them. Marienburg was a small target, Focke-Wulf factory, surrounded by a lot of countryside. It wasn't as much flak. Fighters weren't a concern. They were able to lower to 12,000 feet. Dean Todd, the other oral history that I've been able to look at, he was on that same mission, remembers the exact same thing, that they could see, they had a clear run to target, they were harassed by fighters only minimally on the way out mostly. And then Bertholf, he flies that Münster raid. And if you saw Masters of the Air, and you remember the episode number 5, Rosie Rosenthal's plane is the only one to make it back to the 100th Bomb Group. Bertholf is a plane that was assigned to that mission and had to turn back when one of their engines quit and came back. So when he turned around, that left the 13 heading to Münster, and of that 13, Rosenthal will be the only one to turn back. Both of those guys mentioned flak. I should mention a little bit about how this flak worked. Flak is going to burst up in the sky, sending shrapnel into the plane. It's not designed to blow up a plane, it's designed to spread shrapnel over the plane to disable it. So on the left side of your screen, you see a flak gun. On the right side, flak towers. And these are flak towers from Hamburg. Hamburg, Hitler had huge plans for that city. It was going to be one of his Führer cities. And in fact, these flak towers are still there today. The one that I've got a picture of, archival picture, this is now a hotel. It's in the St. Pauli neighborhood of Hamburg. They were way too expensive and difficult to destroy these very thick concrete structures. So this one has been turned into a hotel with a garden on top. So if you ever make it to Hamburg, walk through the St. Pauli neighborhood, look for that. You won't miss it. It's a very prominent feature on the St. Pauli skyline. Where I started on Black Week was it wasn't a prescribed, we're going to hit them hard in October. It was a combination that the geography, weather, and sunlight lined up to allow Ira Eaker to provide a proof of concept for American daytime pinpoint bombing, taking out a specific military target. He can prove his concept, and he's got a great window before we start losing the daylight, before we're going to lose the numbers of days per month conducive to an accurate bombing run. And what he's hoping is that this will lead to continued momentum into the spring when they can get the bombers back out again. If he can prove this concept, then their doctrine will be correct, and they'll continue this mission, this strategy through to the next year. A little bit on these operational details. Northern Europe, of course, when you vacation there in the summer, seems like the sun never goes down. You're waiting for that light show at the Eiffel Tower. It doesn't start till 11 p.m. sometimes because it's still not dark enough. You go up to Scotland, well, you'll be finished with your whiskey well before the sun goes down. But the opposite is going to be in the winter months, you don't get a lot of daylight. So the average daylight hours, seeing from October, it's a steep decline from there and into December. And when the Army did sort of an operational review of aerial bombardment after the war, they found that there were 5 to 8 days per month in Northern Europe that you could bomb effectively. And that's when they took into account cloud cover and the conditions at takeoff and over the target. The wind, low cloud cover, storms, anything like that, 5 to 8 days per month in Northern Europe of weather conducive. Again, October 8 through 14 is what we're looking at. Those 3 missions stacked right on top of each other, October 8, 9, and 10, are what's going to seriously take a toll. Now, here's one example of a route that we take to Bremen. These aren't straight lines on a map. Once they get their formations off, they're going to fly in formations and take a route to the target that was designed to either confuse the Germans as to what the target can be, to look for weak points in flak and coastal artillery, and to provide maximum bombs over target. So another division or another series of groups might take a different route to Bremen because their target's going to be a separate section of Bremen. So our mission is going to go over water as much as it can, come down over land where conditions will be more dangerous, and then try to get back out to sea and make it back to East Anglia as much as possible. In Bremen, the target was shipyards as our primary target. If you get to the Bremen area and you have a chance to see what's known locally as the Valentin bunker, a giant submarine assembly facility, Bremen and Hamburg, just a little bit to the east, major shipbuilding areas for Nazi Germany. We'll put 399 aircraft over Bremen. 30 of those aircraft will fail to return. 2 of those that return will be considered damaged beyond repair. 124 men killed in action. That includes anyone killed on the plane when it returns, and anyone who is designated as killed in action after their final fate was known, whether they're POW or whatever it was. Wounded that's going to be men inside planes who make it back. And evasion and return, those are guys who get out, find the assistance of a local resistance group, and make it to a neutral country and find their way to get back to England eventually. That's a very rare occurrence that someone is able to evade and return. Looking at the costs of this, I just put up how many aircraft were lost, how many damaged beyond repair. Boeing's own estimate, this was done in a history of Boeing aircraft that was produced in the 1960s, estimated cost of a B-17 in 1943 to 44 time period, about $240,000. To put that into a context of the time, today's rate, roughly $3 million. It's always a little iffy converting into modern dollars. Your average white male income earner in 1939 made $1,000, just over $1,000 per year. So you can see what the cost of a plane is relative to what an average person's salary was in a year that's kind of near to 1943. Then, of course, our human cost. And I've had a chance to visit a lot of ABMC, American Battle Monuments Commission cemeteries over my career. And the way that things work, of course, the family, when they are notified at the end of the war that there's a decision to be made upon the return of remains, the families can choose whether they would like their loved one to remain in an overseas cemetery or be sent home. The breakdown worldwide is roughly 60% home, 40% remain where they are. At the Cambridge American Cemetery, which is this photo, airmen who were permanently interred here were those who died in England, or their remains were in England. So they were killed in action or died of their wounds after a return to England. There's not as many airmen in here as there are spread out among cemeteries on continental Europe, but there is the largest wall of the missing. All the names that are on this wall are individuals whose remains were never found, or if they were found after the inauguration of this wall. This is the largest wall of the missing on a cemetery in Europe. Very large because it'll include the Battle of the Atlantic, naval personnel, infantry who were killed during training, and those airmen whose remains were never discovered and or went down over enemy territory. How it would work in a cemetery on the continent, this is the Luxembourg American Cemetery. If the aircraft was known to have gone down in the region that this cemetery services, that individual's family could make the choice to leave them on the continent. And you'll find things like this in Normandy, in the Netherlands, in Belgium, in Luxembourg, and even as you move further south into Italy and southern France to the cemeteries there. So that's looking a bit at the human cost of some of these missions. And you'll see this is an individual from the 95th Bomb Group, so in that same wing with the 100th and the 390th. Now we look at Marienburg. So I've got a marker on it, very deep penetration, very deep, a very long mission. This mission is going to go approximately 11 hours for most of the crew if they don't encounter any damage to the aircraft. But that's 11 hours in those spaces that I showed you at the beginning. Route that most of the aircraft took was leaving East Anglia toward the bottom left of your screen, flying over the northern tip of Denmark, coming down just a little bit south or over Sweden, and then following the water and entering onto the continent from there and conducting their bombing raid on Marienburg. Very successful. I mentioned they bombed this from 12,000 feet, and you can look at the target here. It's in a rural area, the Focke-Wulf aircraft plant, and you can see evidence that the Germans are already starting to spread out their manufacturing, spread out their resources. We'll put 100 aircraft on Marienburg, losing just 2 of them. And you'll see our casualties, the killed in action, POWs, wounded, and the evasion here. Some aircraft did make emergency landings in Sweden, and landing in a neutral country came with its own problems. You could be interred in that neutral country, look at Switzerland or Spain, or in this case, Sweden. But the aircraft that were considered to be losses, 2 with 10 and 10 on the KIA and POW. And both Dean Todd and Bertholf remember that as being just a great mission and the picture of what aerial bombardment can do. But again, not a major city, not a lot of flak, not a lot of fighters. Now this mission to Münster. And the mission to Münster, I'll put up this image of Rosie Rosenthal. You notice the lack of a mustache compared to his image in the Apple Masters of the Air series. Target railroads and canals. 307 aircraft will be assigned to Münster. Only 133 will make it there. Others will turn back. Here that the conditions are so bad over Münster that they'll deviate to a secondary target or drop their bombs on a target of opportunity on their way back to England. We'll lose 30 of the aircraft. We'll lose 30 aircraft on that mission. Casualties of those 133 that went over Münster, dropped their bombs, and basically were over target. 75 killed in action, 213 POWs, 14 wounded. So those will be individuals who come back wounded on the aircraft. Rosie will be the only aircraft from the 100th Bomb Group from the 13 that ended up crossing the channel onto Europe and completing the mission, he's the only one that's going to make it back. Dean Todd, who I mentioned, flew the Bremen and the Marienburg missions. When his plane is going down, there's a bit, they're not sure if it was flak or fighters. Dean Todd mentions he thinks it was flak over Münster that takes his. As he's getting out, he visually sees that his pilot and several others, including the waist gunner and the turret gunner, are readying to get out, but they can't get out. He's supposed to go out the bomb bay doors, and he has to use an emergency release to it. And what they'll have to do is they put the whole bomb rack out before he comes out. And so just after he gets the bombs out, after he has to use emergency methods to open the bomb bay doors, he goes out, sees his plane in a flat spin, and then it just explodes. And he sees the 6 shoots from his aircraft below him. He makes 7, and killed in action is going to be the pilot, the waist gunner, and the ball turret gunner. The way this information will be listed, that they know that these individuals will be listed as killed in action, is when he gets back to his interrogation, he'll mention that he saw the 6 shoots, he made 7, and then they'll see at the 100th bomb group, they'll be interviewing, and at this point, we're really only looking at Rosie's crew. That is the if that information is what they get. But he's not going to be able to make it back until the end of the war, when they'll ultimately determine that the pilot, waist gunner, and ball turret gunner were killed in action. Masters of the Air kind of shows this when Rosie's crew is coming out from the dogfights, and there's a little bit of a lull in the action, and you see pieces of B-17s falling all around them. When I saw this, I had read Dean Todd's oral history and listened to it prior to this, and I thought, I'm going to go back and look to see if I find a plane in a flat spin. I never saw that, but I did see the sort of raining down of aircraft pieces within that episode. And here's an image of the pilot of Dean Todd's aircraft, Robert Kramer, who was killed in action on that day. Now we go back to Schweinfurt. And this is an October 14 mission. This will be the first major run on Schweinfurt since the August 17 mission, with 60 aircraft lost. And the numbers here are going to be abysmal. If you look at the route that these planes are taking, that's a lot of time over Germany. That's a lot of German fighter airfields between the English Channel and Schweinfurt itself. 62 aircraft lost on this specific raid. This is going to impact Ira Eaker's career on this one, and I'll put a quote up from him as he's writing a letter to Hap Arnold, who he reported to, that you can read quite a few things into this, that yes, the enemy is going to counter the American daylight bombing operations, but they think this is going to be its peak. This is going to be the end. This is going to be the final thrust. Basically, the Germans are putting everything that they have into their defensive posture against this American daylight bombardment. What Eaker's doing is trying to convince, yes, we just took it on the chin with these missions, but there's a positive light ahead. When you look at those numbers, the numbers here, these 7 days in October 1943, and this is it's not going to total up from what I gave. I just gave the certain targets from Black Week, but the total 782 bombers failed to return. That'll equate to 1,499 missing in action. If you take that number and break that out, that's 921 POWs, 490 will be determined to have been killed in action based on those eyewitness reports, or when the prisoners are released, like Dean Todd at the end of the war, from some of their testimonials. But just a horrific losses when you look at this being 1 week, both in terms of bombers, materiel, and airmen themselves. And what are the Germans doing? The Germans will start moving their production. So if one of your goals is to destroy the enemy's capacity to produce, the Germans are moving their production now to underground. They'll put aircraft facilities underground, in caves, inside mountains, or far out of the reach of American bombardment. So is this going to knock out their capacity to produce aircraft? Not really. It's going to take longer to do that than we think. And if you look at the outside, I showed you an internal picture. If you look at the outside of what these facilities look like, it's going to take a miracle drop from a bomb to inflict any damage on a facility like this one. So what's our next steps? They'll reform, they'll retrain, they'll replace. With those losses from Black Week, Ira Eaker is still going to be short 170 aircraft, even after they've accounted for what they expected to lose and from anticipated replacement aircraft coming over from the United States. They're going to have to reform, retrain, and replace those lost bombers and those lost crews. What we get into when spring begins, targets suddenly become a little less important than killing the Luftwaffe. And this is going to be this initiative of clearing the skies for the ground. The invasion of Northern Europe, the invasion of Western Europe, I should say, with D-Day is coming. And if we're to achieve air superiority, leading to air supremacy, our planes will be the only ones in the sky when our boots are on the ground. It's not about blowing up targets. It's not about stopping production of planes. It's about killing the pilots. As I've shown in those pictures, the Germans can move their production facilities around, but it's more difficult for them to train pilots, effective pilots, than it is to build an aircraft. And I should say, all of this is playing into a role of unconditional surrender. And that's where I'll say bombing will have a role to play when we talk about unconditional surrender versus a negotiated peace. And then, of course, we'll be moving, Curtis LeMay's picture on a Time magazine cover, they'll be moving to our effort against Japan once Germany is knocked out of the war. So looking at the legacy, was this effective? When you look at what happens with aerial bombardment, effectiveness toward a route of unconditional surrender, I would say yes. Unconditional surrender, often we found this with both Germany and Japan, requires the enemy to be defeated, look like it's been defeated, and feel like it's been defeated. When your cities are rubble, when your enemy's boots are on your ground, and when there's no more option but to quit, you see unconditional surrender. As I've mentioned, Donald Miller likes to say this a lot, the world's first and only bomber war. It's an Allied victory in a sort of this to that ramp up of effort that will lead to bombers in waves of 1,000 leaving the English coast heading toward German cities. In Korea, I mentioned 1,000 bombers to conduct raids on one city in World War II. By the time we get to Korea, we can put numbers of B-29s in the dozens over North Korean targets and have a similar impact to what we were having in World War II that was taking hundreds to thousands of bombers. And of course, what we don't see anymore is putting 1,000 planes with crews of 10 together to bomb targets. That bombardment with pinpoint accuracy and sort of taking the human factor out in the delivery of the explosive or delivery of the missile or the bomb, that's where we sit today with this. And when I look at where I work and what I do, I see the kind of final testament, final tribute to this bomber war. Being in the nose art that I know Steve did a fantastic Warbird tube on that you can find on the YouTube channel, but this nose art, these pieces of aircraft that saw combat that were scrapped, these aircraft that saw combat scrapped at the end of the war, disassembled, no longer needed because this type of warfare would not happen again. I get every day I get a chance to walk through and see not just these pictures, not just this art, but this lasting testimonial to this effort. And so I thank you for that, and I'll stick on a little bit with Steve.
Well, great. Nathan, thank you. Great presentation. And when we look back at Black Week and you look at the numbers of the men and material that was lost, how long did it take kind of as you said, reform and retrain? How long was that entire process?
So there's sometimes you'll read that because of Black Week, we didn't do deep penetration missions again. And it had less to do with Black Week than it had to do with those environmental factors. Ira Eaker is going to be transferred to the Mediterranean. And so I'm doing kind of a roundabout answer, but I'll get there. He's going to be transferred to the Mediterranean. What this brings in is a different focus when they're looking at supporting the ground instead of destroying targets of production and opportunity. They'll be rebuilt by the spring when they renew their offensive with a different focus on it. They'll be ready to go in the spring. They're going to lessen these missions in December, but they're going to have to do that out of necessity because of conditions, less so because they've had all these losses.
So with that, and as you pointed out, the shift in focus from trying to destroy the factories and the infrastructure into more of a, later in the war, the bombing mission still had, we're going to Berlin or we're going wherever, but it was more nuts. The target was important, but it was also equally important to bring the fighters out and to reduce, as you mentioned.
So you still want a raid that the Germans are going to defend against. So a target like Berlin, they're going to throw everything they've got. And in fact, they will continue to throw huge defenses. They'll put every fighter they can muster to defend Berlin when we're conducting raids there in the spring of 1945. But the bombers become like bait. And to draw the fighters out, and where in 1943, the fighters were being a bit frustrated. Allied fighters, our fighters, were being a bit frustrated because they were told to stick close to the formations. Right. In 1944 and into 45, they're getting increasing amounts of freedom to go engage and bring down those German fighters.
So in the end, as you look at it from a historical perspective, was Ira Eaker's idea, was it a failure, or was it just maybe a victim of changing circumstance that it didn't continue?
I'd come down on the victim of circumstance. I always like to say you never know how a war is going to be won or how it's going to end until it does. And if you're not trying it, if you're not pushing the envelope of what's possible, or you're not going to know how to adjust if you don't put yourself out there in the first place. So unless you're trying daylight bombing of military targets, you're not going to have those next steps that's going to lead to those pilot killing missions. You're not going to start the churning. Now, Eaker won't be the one to oversee that with the bomb groups of the 8th Air Force, but his efforts are what's going to do it. And I often get these kind of questions when we look at the atomic bomb or the end of the war. When you look at campaigns in, say, Philippines with the Americans and Indonesia for the Australians, and you can say there's a lot of loss of life for territory we didn't need. We didn't know what was going to bring about the end of the war. And so we're progressing on multiple fronts, multiple ideas, multiple initiatives. And ultimately, they'll be tried until the most senior person to make a decision decides we're going to shift course.
What about the human element? What happened in it's different from every airman, but those who made it through these missions in October, and then subsequent missions, that the few missions that happened the rest of 1943, how are they then integrated with the replacements that are coming in? And you've read about some resentment and things like that. Was that isolated cases, or was it more widespread?
I think what you'll see from those who are going through, whether you have an airman who's gone through 20 missions and they've lost, maybe every crew that they initially arrived at base with is gone. It ranges from, in some cases, anger that these new recruits think they're even in the realm of readiness for what they're going to be exposed to I don't even want to learn their names until they've done 10 missions because it's not worth it. I'm not going to see them that long. And I've read from some of the testimonials, oral histories we have, both of those perspectives on it.
For those who would like more information about Black Week, do you have books that you might recommend?
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely read Don Miller's Masters of the Air. I mean, that's your 8th Air Force introductory text, definitely with that. Harry Crosby's On a Wing and a Prayer. To get that, he was there and he did it. Perspective on it, I don't think you can really top that one. In fact, if you've watched Masters of the Air on Apple, you read On a Wing and a Prayer, you'll find that's the story that's being told, and that's where you can start your nitpicking of this didn't happen exactly that way. Huegen wasn't in London doing that phone call. That was Crosby, and so that's kind of a fun one to combine, especially with watching that series.
Very good. Well, Nathan, thank you for joining us and sharing the perspective on Black Week, and we'll look forward. I understand there are some other topics that we'll be able to tap you for in the future on Warbird Tube, and we'll look forward to that.
All right, great. Thanks so much, Steve.
And thank you for joining us tonight. We'd love to hear from you and hear any thoughts you have on tonight's episode or ideas you might have for a future topic. Feel free to drop us a line at media@cafhq.org. And if you like tonight's show, please share it across your social media platforms. And remember, if you are subscribing on YouTube, we thank you for those of you who have subscribed, but also make sure you click that bell icon. You'll get notifications when our new episodes are posted. Until next time, I'm Steve Bush wishing you blue skies and tailwinds. Have a great night.